Everybody in this compound will hear the truth today. Michael, watch your mouth. This is not a place for madness.
Enough. Let it stay buried.
Buried for 30 years, Papa. I will not let it stay buried one more day. The boy does not know what he is saying. Somebody should take him inside. Ask him. Ask my uncle whose hand held the spray that took my father's eyes.
Michael, please.
You have no proof. You are chasing shadows. Mama Rebecca carried the water that day. She saw everything. Deny it in front of her. Stop, please. It was me. I blinded my own brother.
Kenneth's hands found the young mounds before his feet did, moving across the ridges the way a man reads a face he has known for 40 years. He did not need his eyes for this. He had not needed them for a long time. Behind him, his son Michael stood at the edge of the farm with his arms folded, watching his father walk soil he himself refused to touch anymore. "Papa, let me call Emeka to finish that row," Michael said, not moving closer. "You will fall." "I have not fallen in 15 years, Kenneth answered, straightening his back, his clouded eyes turned toward the sound of his son's voice. "This farm knows me better than most people know their own children." Michael said nothing. He looked instead toward the dirt road that curved out of their village and disappeared toward Enugu, toward the buses that left every morning carrying young men to places where nobody knew their fathers, where nobody whispered, "That is the blind man's son," whenever he passed. He had grown up on that whisper. It had followed him through primary school, through the market, through every gathering where his mates had fathers who could see them off to football matches, fathers who could read their school reports without someone reading it aloud first. His mother had died before Michael could remember her face, and Kenneth had raised him alone, blind, poor, and endlessly patient, teaching him that beauty could be smelt in rain before it fell, heard in the particular laugh of a child, felt in the roughness of a mango skin before the sweetness underneath. Michael had memorized these lessons the way one memorizes an old song from childhood. He hummed the tune without ever fully believing the words. When Michael was 12, a boy named Chidi had mocked him in front of the whole class, asking how a blind man could ever teach anyone anything worth learning. He had fought him behind the school block until both their noses bled, and when his father asked what happened, he had lied and said he fell. He had not wanted Kenneth to know the shame was already planted, growing quietly under everything Kenneth tried to teach him. There had also been other moments too, smaller ones that stacked quietly on top of each other over the years until Michael could no longer tell which shame belonged to which memory. There was the day his teacher asked the class to bring a parent for a school project on family trades, and Michael spent 3 days inventing excuses rather than bring Kenneth to stand before children who would only see a man tapping a stick on the classroom floor. There was the wedding of his cousin in Suka, where Michael had steered his father to the farthest table, away from the photographers, telling himself it was for Kenneth's comfort, when really it was for his own. Kenneth had never complained about any of it. He had simply asked each time what the room looked like, what colors the women wore, whether the moon was full that night, gathering the world secondhand through his son's descriptions, and never once asking why Michael's voice grew thin and reluctant when the questions came in public. There was a particular Sunday, not long before David's car appeared on the dirt road, when Michael had walked his father to church and a group of young men from a neighboring village had laughed loudly as they passed, one of them calling out that Michael must have sinned greatly in a past life to be cursed with such a father. Michael had said nothing. He had gripped his father's arm tighter than necessary and walked faster. And Kenneth, feeling the tension in his son's grip, had simply said, "Slow down, my son. The church is not running away from us," never guessing that his son's haste came from shame rather than piety. That evening, years later, his uncle David arrived in a car newer than anything the village had seen that year, its paint catching the dying light so brightly that children ran from their compounds just to touch the bonnet. "David, my brother's son, look at you," David said, stepping out and pulling Michael into an embrace that smelt of leather seats and money. "A grown man now, too grown to be wasting his life in this village fetching water for a blind man." "He is my father," Michael said, although the words came out smaller than he intended, swallowed almost as soon as they left him. "And I am asking as your uncle who loves you both," David said, lowering his voice as though the compound itself might overhear. "There is a place in Enugu, a proper home, run by good people, where men like your father are cared for by trained hands, fed on time, kept safe, checked by doctors every week. You cannot build a future carrying a blind man on your back forever, Michael. Even Kenneth would not want that for you, if he was honest with himself. A young man like you, strong, capable, wasting his best years pouring water for an old man who cannot even see the sun he's sitting under." Michael turned to see if his father had heard. Kenneth sat outside their small house waving a fishing net with fingers that never fumbled, his face turned toward the sound of his brother's voice with an expression Michael could not read. For one uneasy moment, Michael wondered whether his father's calm was patience or something closer to old grief he had never spoken aloud. Over the following days, David did not let the matter rest. He returned each afternoon with fresh arguments, each one wrapped in the language of love. He brought glossy pamphlets from the facility in Enugu, photographs of clean rooms and smiling caretakers, promises of a monthly allowance for Michael if he simply agreed to sign. He spoke to labourers in the market, planting the idea that Michael was suffering unfairly, that no one would blame a young man for wanting his own life. Slowly, the village began to murmur the same question David had been asking all along. Was it fair that Michael's future should be spent entirely in service of his father's past? Michael found himself unable to sleep, turning David's words over each night like stones in his palm, searching for the sharp edge he knew must be hidden somewhere inside such generosity. He walked one night to the edge of the compound where old Mama Rebecca sat outside her hut, roasting groundnuts over a low fire, as she did most nights when sleep refused her old bones. "You are troubled," she said before he even spoke, not lifting her eyes from the low crackling fire in front of her. "Sit." He sat. He told her everything. David's offer, the shelter in Enugu, the shame he could no longer carry through the market every morning, the exhaustion of explaining his father to every stranger who looked at him with pity dressed in kindness. Mama Rebecca was quiet for a long time, turning the groundnuts with a stick, the fire popping softly between them. "Do you know how your father lost his sight?" Michael said. "Family accident. Everyone knows this. It is not a secret." "Everyone knows what they were told," Mama Rebecca said, finally looking at him. "I am old enough to know what actually happened, because I was the one who carried water to that farm the very afternoon it happened, 30 years ago, before your mother even knew your father's name. Sit properly, because I will only say this once, and then I will never speak of it again as long as I live." She told him. 30 years ago, Kenneth and David had gone together to clear a portion of bush for planting, using a homemade chemical spray their late father had mixed and left behind for them, a spray strong enough to blind a man if it touched his eyes unprotected. David had been careless with the mixture, arguing loudly over whose turn it was to carry the tank, and in his carelessness had splashed it directly into his own brother's face. Kenneth had screamed, had stumbled blind through the bush begging for water, had been rushed to the village clinic too late for anything to be done. And David, terrified of what their strict father would do to him, terrified of losing his place as the favored younger son who could do no wrong, had told a different story to everyone who asked. That Kenneth had mishandled the spray carelessly himself, blind now because of his own foolishness, a cautionary tale rather than an accusation against his brother. Kenneth had never once corrected it, not to their father, not to the village, not even to the wife he later married. For 30 years, he had carried the weight of a lie that was never his to carry. "Why would my father protect the man who blinded him?" Michael asked, his voice breaking apart in the darkness. "Because your father decided a long time ago that carrying the truth alone was lighter than watching his brother carry the shame of it in front of the whole village," Mama Rebecca said. "That is not weakness, Michael. That is a kind of strength you have not yet learned to recognize, because you have spent your whole life looking at your father's blindness and calling it his only wound." Michael did not sleep at all that night. He lay awake replaying every memory he had of his uncle's visits, every gift, every laugh, every generous word, and saw beneath each one now the shape of a debt David had never once acknowledged, let alone repaid. In the morning, He found his uncle already at the compound, pressing Kenneth gently to sign the papers for the shelter, speaking of dignity and rest and a life free of burden, using kindness as a blade to cut his own guilt cleanly away from himself. Kenneth's hand hovered near the paper David had placed before him, patient as always, ready to sacrifice comfort once more if it would ease his son's path. Michael stood at the entrance of the compound, his whole body shaking with a fury he had never felt toward anyone in his life. "Everybody should hear this today," he said, loud enough that neighbors began stepping out of their doorways, drawn by something in his voice none of them had heard from him before. David turned, his easy smile faltering just slightly. "Michael, calm yourself. This is not the place for whatever is troubling you." "Son, let him be," Kenneth said quietly, reaching for his son's arm, sensing something in the air he could not see but could feel gathering like a storm above the compound. "Tell them what you did to my father," Michael said, his voice no longer shaking but cutting clean through the morning air like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Tell them whose hand held that spray 30 years ago. Tell them why he has spent his whole life explaining away a story that was never his to carry while you built a life in Lagos on top of the silence he gave you for free." The compound went completely silent. Neighbors who had gathered out of simple curiosity now stood frozen, understanding arriving in their faces one by one like a slow sunrise over the rooftops. David's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. He looked at his brother, at the calm, sightless face that had never once in 30 decades betrayed him, even now, even standing at the very edge of exposure. "It is true," Kenneth said finally into the silence, his voice steady despite everything. "All of it. I did not want my brother to spend his life the way I feared he would if the village knew. Hated, blamed, unable to build anything for himself, unable to look his father in the eye. I decided my eyes were smaller loss than his whole future." David fell to his knees in the dirt, his expensive trousers meeting the same earth he had spent 30 years trying to outrun with every naira he ever made. He wept the way men weep only once or twice in a lifetime, ugly and unguarded, apologizing to a brother who had spent 30 decades protecting the very story that should have shamed him. "I do not deserve the silence you kept for me," David said, his voice breaking apart completely. Kenneth reached down, found his brother's shoulder with the same certainty he found the yam mounds, and lifted him gently to his feet. "You are still my brother. That has not changed since we were boys sharing one mat in our father's house before either of us knew what the world would ask of us. What changes now is that you stop running from what you did, and I stop carrying it alone. We share it. That is all I ever wanted from the very first day." The village watched a man who arrived in a car worth more than every house on that road kneel in the dirt and be forgiven by his brother who had wronged him. And something shifted permanently in how they would speak of both men from that morning forward. Michael stood apart from it all, understanding arriving in him slowly, like water finding the lowest point in soil after a long rain. His father had never been the burden he was ashamed to carry through the market. His father had been carrying something far heavier than blindness for 30 years and had done it so quietly, so completely without complaint that his own son had mistaken the weight of that silence for weakness. In the weeks that followed, David did not disappear back to Lagos as everyone expected. He stayed, first out of guilt too heavy to outrun a second time, then out of something closer to love reawakened after 30 years of distance. He funded a proper clinic wing in the village in his brother's name, quietly, without announcement or photographs, in the same manner Kenneth had always done things throughout his life. Michael tore up the shelter papers David had once pushed toward his father, and instead built a small extension to their own house with his own two hands, a room with a wide window that let in the morning sun Kenneth could not see, but could still feel warm against his skin every single day. Michael no longer walked ahead of his father in the market, embarrassed by the slower pace or the stares of strangers. He walked beside him now, describing colors when Kenneth asked, although by now he privately suspected his father saw more of the village's true character than anyone with working eyes ever had. When old classmates who had once whispered behind his back greeted him now in the market, Michael introduced his father by name, loudly, without flinching, watching their faces search for the mockery they used to wear, and finding instead that Michael no longer gave them room for it. In the evenings, Michael began sitting where Mama Rebecca once sat, roasting groundnuts of his own over the same low fire, learning to read the world the way his father had always tried patiently to teach him, not through what the eyes alone captured, but what a heart was finally patient enough to notice. Months later, at the same church where Michael had once quickened his pace out of shame, the village held a small ceremony for the completion of the clinic wing David had funded. Kenneth was asked to speak, and though he had never once sought attention in 30 years, he stood before the gathered villagers, his son beside him rather than behind him, and spoke of a beauty he had learned to see only after losing his sight, a beauty of a brother's shame finally set down, of a son who had once been ashamed, learning instead to stand close, of a life that had taught him more through darkness than most men learn with their eyes wide open. The same young men who had once mocked Michael on the road to church stood among the crowd that day, silent, and Michael did not need to look at them to know their laughter had turned quietly into something closer to respect. The village began telling a new story about the blind farmer and his brother, one that did not end in old shame, but in the strange, hard-won beauty of a truth finally allowed to breathe after 30 long years underground. And Michael, who had once ready to trade his father for an easier life in the city, understood at last that his father had never needed eyes to see clearly. It was Michael who was blind all along, and it was his father, patiently, without a single bitter word in 30 years, who had finally taught his son how to see. Have you ever discovered a truth your own parent chose to carry silently to protect someone else? If this story touched you, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs it today. And drop a comment. We want to hear from you. God bless you.